Okay. Well, thank you all for tuning in tonight, and we have the pleasure of having Dr. Philip Brown from Virginia Cooperative Extension. He's an extension specialist in soil science and septic systems, and he's going to talk to us about the basics of home septic systems this evening. So I appreciate you, Dr. Brown, for speaking with us, and thanks to you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me, Phil, and I really appreciate appreciate you all showing up to uh to listen to this talk. Yeah, I'm going to run through kind of the basics of septic systems, how they operate, why they operate. We'll run through some of the policies that are in place and why certain septic systems are used for certain reasons. And we'll run through some of the alternative systems at the end as well, hopefully. Oh, I've just skipped ahead. So yeah, I'm Philip Brown from the VCE, and I work over at Virginia Tech. So I'm in Christiansburg at the moment. So let's see. So I always say this because I'm employed to talk about septic systems, but I always say that they're a great way of combining soil science and engineering, and that they provide an easy and environmentally conscious way to dispose of household waste. Some people don't necessarily agree with that, and I can see a point. If a septic system is failing, then it is no longer environmentally conscious. But if the septic system is put in and we are treating it correctly, it is, it's a great operating, it's a great feat of engineering. It doesn't require any electrics, or the most simple ones don't require any electrics, and it just moves all the wastewater from the house out into a drain field, and we can kind of almost forget about it. However, if they do mismanage, they can fail. And when they do fail, they can cause a lot of problems. We can think about environmental problems such as eutrophication, or they can kill off creatures living in water bodies. And then we've got human health problems. And we can, I mean, typhoid potentially. I was reading the other day, I think there was cases of hookworm coming from septic systems in Alabama, and I don't think there's been hookworm in the US for many, many years, but they're coming, these are come out of septic systems, and the kind of failed septic systems, so they can be problematic. But so long as we treat them correctly, then there shouldn't be a problem. And over on the right hand side of the screen here, we have kind of the earliest form of a septic system, and this came out in France in the 1860s. And this one was actually plumbed into sewage lines, but you can see the basics of. We'll look at a septic system shortly, or an image of a septic system, and we'll see that the basics of this septic system continue on in a kind of other ones. We have a place where the wastewater comes in. We've got a trap that collects the solids, and we've got a place where the wastewater leaves. And in this instance, it moves into the sewers. In most instances, in Virginia, we're putting it into the soil and allowing the soil to treat the wastewater. And one of the problems we've had throughout our time on the planet is getting rid of human waste. As I mentioned earlier on, we do have human health problems that comes from human waste. So removing it has been kind of one of the big things, especially when population started to grow, and we needed, better ways of removing human waste rather than just wandering off into the woods and digging a hole. So if we look up at the top, let's see, can I get, uh, if we look at the top left here, we can see this is a Roman baths. So the Romans were big into sanitation. They did a lot of really good work in sanitation. But this is Roman baths, and it's a giant shared bathroom where everyone would kind of get together and they'd chat about the day whilst they sat around together, doing the business. There's kind of these tales that in the Roman baths there was a single sponge dipped in vinegar that was shared between everyone there. I'm not sure how much I believe that. I think there'd be a lot more dead Romans if that was the case, but that was kind of one of the stories that goes along with it. Down here in the middle at the bottom, this is a medieval castle, and essentially it was just a giant long drop. So, and the kind of around the turrets, there was a big open area, and people could use the bathroom from a high point in the turret. Over here on the left-hand side, we've got an advertisement for John Hunt. And John Hunt was a nightman and a rubbish carter. And what his job was as a nightman was he would show up in the middle of the night and haul off the human waste that had been placed outside people's houses. Obviously, this is something that more affluent people were able to afford. But yeah, this was usually carried off, and they used to make fertilizer out of it, which is quite interesting. Um, but yeah, that was a whole genre of employment was being nightmen. Up on the right hand side here, we have a street. This is in York. I'm not from Southwest Virginia. You may have guessed that by now. I'm originally from Yorkshire in England, and this is York, which is kind of the capital city of Yorkshire. And it's got some of these old streets hanging around still. And people used to sit in the top of when they wanted to get rid of the waste in the morning. They would throw it out of the top of the house window, and it would drop down onto the street, and we just carried it down the gutters to wherever it might end up. And if you happen to be unfortunate enough to be walking under these whilst they were throwing the waste out, you got covered in waste, which seems pretty disgusting. And the bottom right hand side, we have this is Thomas Jefferson's outhouse. So, moving into America, we have these kind of systems of getting rid of waste as well. And in the top at the middle, this is the first septic tank, or an image of the first septic tank that made it to the US. And this was in the 1880s, and it was up in Boston. And you can see the kind of the components of the two chambers and the inlets and the outlets in there as well. So by the 1880s, the septic tanks started to move in. It's important to know with a septic system that whatever goes down the drain will end up in the septic tank. So if you, whenever you do any washing, all of that washing up, all of that washing make all of the water from the washing makes it to the septic tank. If you have a bath or a shower, that will also make it to the septic tank. If you have food, oh, I forgot the name of that thing. A food disposal thing that grinds up the food, that will make it into the septic tank as well. When you do your washing up, garbage disposal unit, that was it. When you're doing your washing up, all of that makes it to the septic tank, dishwasher, and if this, like this gentleman here, you like to wash your bicycle in the bath, that will also make it to the septic tank. So let's have a quick review of a conventional gravity flow septic system. This is like the Cadillac of septic systems, really. It's the easiest one and the best one to maintain. So we have a look at the image. We have a house and we've got an outlet coming from the house that brings wastewater to the septic tank. And then from the septic tank, it moves out to a distribution box, and the distribution box moves it evenly between the drain field, the lines of the drain field. And this little box here is kind of designed to represent the drain field. Some people call them absorption areas, soil treatment areas. They go by various different names, but usually drain field is what we call them. In some instances, septic systems may have a pump on them, and this is usually if your septic tank ends up below the drain field. So sometimes the soil below the house might not be suitable, but the soil above the house is more suitable, and so a pump is used to pump the wastewater up the hill to the drain field above. And in some instances, septic systems also require an area called a reserve area. This is required for soils that don't drain particularly well. and we'll talk about different types of soils in a little bit. But slow-moving soils usually contain a lot of clay, and so clayey soils tend to have a reserve area. In most places in Virginia, it's a 50%, but certain counties they can require 100%, and some have a 200%. I think Loudoun and Fairfax may have a 200% one. So let's look at the various components. So the first component is the septic tank. And septic tanks can be compartmentalized or they can be open. And sometimes septic tanks can be put in series. And we'll see kind of why series might work and why compartments might work as well. And they can be made of various materials. Probably the one that springs to my mind usually is a concrete tank. And concrete tanks are concrete tanks. The good thing about concrete tanks is concrete is extremely strong, especially if it's been made correctly. And that means that when it's buried in the ground, it's not likely to break. If you imagine, I was kind of using an example of about a cubic yard of soil weighs roughly a ton. And you imagine that if you put that on top of something, it's a lot of weight for it to cope with. So concrete septic tanks are useful in that context. The trouble with concrete tanks is they're incredibly heavy. These tanks here on the bottom right, they require a large truck to kind of transport them and to drop them in place. They're not easy to move around. Alternatives to the concrete tank are fiberglass or polyethylene plastic. So fiberglass and plastic tanks can also be used as well. And you can imagine that these may not be as strong as a concrete tank, but they have the advantage of being easily transportable. In many cases, you can get kind of 3 or 4 people around one of these plastic tanks, and they can carry it and drop it into place as needed. It's beneficial in kind of mountainous areas where it's difficult to get a truck that carries concrete tanks up kind of steep slopes. So it'd be easier to have a plastic tank put in place. And they are all supposed to be kind of a sufficient standard that they won't break. In terms of the concrete tanks, you can have top seam. So the ones on the right-hand side here, these are top seam tanks. And that means that the lid is dropped on the top. And then you have mid-seam tanks. And the ones on the right-hand side here, you can see are mid-seam tanks, where it's two halves dropped on top of each other, and they're held together by this incredibly sticky black stuff that I don't think anyone really knows what it is. I think it may have come from outer space at some point, and they've just been using it for these septic tanks. It's quite amazing. You can lift one of these tanks by the top half, and it's just this black sticky stuff that holds the two halves together. So it's very good in terms of holding them together, and it should be watertight. If you use a mid-seam tank, there is that kind of worry at the middle of the tank, maybe a weak point. So top seam tanks don't have that problem. Here is our 2 compartment septic tank, and I've drawn it with 2 compartments just kind of to describe it a little bit easier. But when we look at this tank, we see we've got an inlet, and wastewater comes in from the inlet and it drops down into the septic tank. There is a T inside the septic tank, and the T is there in order to try and cause as little disruption of the wastewater in the tank as possible, because we really want settling time inside these tanks. We want the wastewater to be able to sit as long as possible. And if we keep on pouring water over the top of it, it tends to stir it up and leave us with less settling time in the tank. So we've got the wastewater coming in, and it moves down through the T and into the septic tank. At this point, we want it to settle. So we want it to sit there for a while, and we want the solids to drop out to the bottom. And that's what we've got here called sludge. And so these are all the heavy organic matter that's dropping down to the bottom. And then at the top, we have a layer of material that is lighter than water. And these are your fats, oils, and greases. And quite often you might hear it called fog. And so whenever we clean dishes or clean pots and pans that we've done any kind of cooking in, some oil will make it into the tank from that. And you imagine just gradually over time that builds up and builds up. Also, when we wash our hair, wash our bodies, wash our clothes, grease also comes off those as well. So we're constantly putting grease into the tank. And so that grease sits on the top and heavy material sits on the bottom. And what we end up with in the middle is partially treated wastewater. And the wastewater in the tank is then we have anaerobic bacteria. So this is bacteria that doesn't need oxygen and it starts to eat the organic matter. It wants a carbon source, and the organic matter gives it that carbon source. And so it can break down the estimate between, well, roughly about 50% of the solids that go into a tank gets broken down by these bacteria. In this instance, I've drawn it as a two-compartment tank. And so we've got the second compartment over here. The idea of this compartment is it keeps more of the sludge and the scum out of this section. So this compartment is made up of cleaner water, which is a peculiar thing to say because it's very much not clean water. But it's kind of potentially got less solids and less fog in than this side of the tank. And this one also has a T and an outlet. Now, the T or the outlet in this instance is lower than the inlet. So every time wastewater comes in here, it gets pushed out over here. So every time wastewater comes into the tank, cleaner wastewater is moved out the opposite side of the tank. In some instances, they will put tanks in series. So we'll have one tank and another tank, and that works the same way. The first tank will be the one that holds most of the solids, and then it moves the cleaner wastewater into the second tank. And so we have a cleaner tank that can move wastewater out into the drain field. We also have inspection ports or risers. These are so we can look into the tank, make sure that we don't have too much solids in there, too many fats, make sure that the T's are in place, make sure all the components are working correctly. So here is an image of how the tank works. So from the house, we get the kind of dirty wastewater come in. That fills up the septic tank. It's allowed to settle, and as it settles, solids drop to the bottom, and the greases move to the top. And in the middle, we have cleaner water. And now every time wastewater comes into the tank, this dirty wastewater, we get cleaner wastewater moving out of the tank. And it's important that we have clean water moving out of the tank because that is heading towards the drain field. And we'll talk a little bit about the drain field shortly. But before it reaches the drain field, we actually go through a distribution box. And distribution boxes are these little boxes that distribute the wastewater evenly between the drain lines. Different septic systems have different designs, and you can have an array of number of how many drain lines there are. And so the distribution box sends it out to them evenly. It used to be that they had to be set level, and there used to be quite a lot of problems with that because ground settles over time. So distribution box would kind of drop down and move around over time. But there came up these really cool inventions called speed levels, and they can be twisted, and you can use them and make sure that the bottom of this is always level with the water, and that way you can move water evenly. From the distribution box, it then moves to the drain field, and there's a bunch of different kind of designs of drain field. The one that in my mind kind of sticks out is a gravel drain field with a pipe in the middle of it, and the wastewater moves down the pipe into the gravel, and then it moves through that gravel and gets to the soil at the bottom. The soil is what treats the wastewater for the final time. And inside the soil, we have aerobic bacteria. So remember, in the tank, we had anaerobic bacteria. These don't need oxygen. In the soil, we have aerobic bacteria. These ones do require oxygen, and they break down the rest of the pollutants, or break down the rest of the solids in that may make it out to the drain field, kind of small quantities. The soil also acts to trap various pollutants. It behaves like a filter. And so we can remove most of the problems, the viruses, the bacteria, the pathogens, are removed before it reaches the water table, which is what we're trying to do. So here's our drain field. And from the septic tank, wastewater moves to the distribution box, and then it moves out to the drain field. And from the drain field, got the same kind of image here. And in the drain field, we start to get the wastewater moving down through the soil. But before it reaches the groundwater at the bottom, the soil treats it. And so it treats it to the extent that anything reaching the groundwater doesn't contain any level of pollutants, pathogens, whatever it might be, that could cause potential harm further down the line. And in Virginia, we do that by having 18 inches of vertical separation. So that means below the line that the water enters the drain field, the soil, we need 18 inches before it reaches the groundwater. And the idea in Virginia is that in those 18 inches, we have enough bacteria, we have enough filtration, we have enough kind of breakdown of all of these dangerous pollutants that by the time it reaches that groundwater, it has been fully treated and it's not a problem anymore. It's interesting between states, it kind of this separation distance changes quite significantly. I used to work in South Carolina, and South Carolina is 6 inches, so they only require 6 inches between the bottom of the drain field and the groundwater. And then if you go over to Maryland, it ends up being 3 foot, so 36 inches, twice the depth that we use. I would say that 18 inches seems to work. In Virginia, we don't have kind of drain fields not working because we don't have this depth. It's usually another reason that we will see failures. If you look at the chart, this is our 18 inches. We can treat the wastewater a little bit more. That's kind of a story for another time, but we can actually shorten that distance by cleaning up the water before it actually makes it into the drain field. So here is kind of our image of a drain field. At the bottom here, we've got our groundwater. We've got our trench made up of gravel. And through the trench, we have this 4-inch PVC pipe. And the gravel sits above it and below it. The pipe is corrugated. So it's actually 13 inches rather than 12 inches. When you look at this addition, some of you might have seen it. 6 plus 4 plus 2 is 12, but I've got 13. It's actually 13 because of the corrugated where the pipe sits. And the width of the trench can vary. It can be a minimum of 18 and a maximum of 36 inches. But the important thing is we get these 18 inches here. So who is coming out and deciding where your septic system is going, what design you have on your septic system, and kind of who is signing off on that? Well, in order for a septic system to be installed, you have to have it's got to be designed by either someone from Department of Health, or it's got to be an on-site soil evaluator or a private engineer. So these are the people who will come out and do this work. They are qualified to do this work. If they don't have any of these, licenses, they can't design these systems and they won't be approved by Department of Health. In the end, they fill in some form that looks similar to this on the right-hand side. Different counties may have different forms, but they will fill it in and they will come up with a design of the septic system on your land that will work. If they are just designing conventional systems, they can be a conventional OSE. But if they are designing alternative septic systems, which we'll get to at the end, these are slightly more complicated, require a little bit more expertise in that type of system, then they have to be an alternative OSE. When the OSE comes out to evaluate the lot, they run through a bunch of different things, and these are some of the bits and pieces that they are looking for. So they're looking for the depth of the soil. They're making sure it's not a shallow soil. If it's a shallow soil, it's really hard to get that 18 inches that are needed for the conventional system. They're looking for soils called shrink swell soils. These soils are terrible for most things. When they get wet, they swell up and water doesn't move through them. And when they dry out, they open up and huge cracks form in them, and water moves through them incredibly quickly, which obviously is a problem if you're trying to treat water. So, kind of either way, they work very, very badly. They're also looking for the distances to a well or something else that may cause pollution on that site. They are looking for the shape and contour of the site, and the image on the right. This is against contour, and you imagine if they put a drain line in going that way, all of that wastewater is going to move straight down that hill and start collecting at the bottom and causing all kinds of problems. So they are trying to find contour across that hill and making sure that the wastewater moves through the soil evenly. They're looking for drainage ways. If there's a drainage way, a swale or something like that on the land, they need to avoid that because that's where water collects. And if water collects, that means that it's more likely to overpower the septic system and bring wastewater to the surface. They're looking for floodplains because they don't want kind of flooding to occur and wastewater being moved into rivers. They're looking for physical soil restrictions, so hard pans, and they're looking for depth to seasonal high water tables. So by looking at the soil, they can evaluate how deep the seasonal high water table is, and making sure that there's 18 inches between that and the bottom of the drain field. And another thing that they look at that's really quite important is soil texture, and we'll get onto soil texture in just a little bit. When they come out to a lot, they will usually start boring holes. In some instances, they may have they can use pits as well. So they may have like a mini excavator of some kind, and they can dig a pit and look at the soil that way. But they usually have to dig 5 boreholes is kind of the minimum that's required, unless they do 3 boreholes that are incredibly similar, and then they don't have to do the 2 others. And lo and behold, you will find that a lot of people do 3 boreholes that look very similar. So, but technically 5 is the minimum that needs to be done. And if they are good boreholes, then um, they can find an area where they can put the drain field. If the borehole is kind of grey and ugly looking, like the one on the right hand side there, then they will avoid that area and not put a drain field in there. So they will look for that area where they've got the good soil, and that's where they will design the drain field. Um, So they are looking at soil textures. And when we're going to do a kind of a very brief soil textures kind of discussion. So when we think about soil texture, we are basically breaking soil down into 3 components. Sand, which is the largest pieces and drains readily. Silt, which are intermediate particles and drain kind of intermediately. And clay, which is the fine particles that do not drain particularly readily. Now, that's not to say that they don't drain. Clay soils, if it's a bright red clay soil, it drains, it just drains slowly. Um, and if we have a look at the textural triangle over here on the right, we can see on the left-hand side, we're increasing clay. So as we move up that textural triangle, we see as we move into this blue, we call that texture group 4, and those soils are clay soils. They don't drain particularly quickly. And because they don't drain quickly, we have to design very large drain fields to accommodate the wastewater that comes out. Over on along the bottom, we see it increases in percent sand. So as we go from this side, as we go from the right to left, we're increasing in sand. And over on the left-hand side, we see sand, loamy sand, sandy loam, sandy clay loam. All of these drain very readily. And these are texture group 1, 2A, and 2B. When septic drain fields are designed on these, they tend to be quite small drain fields because the water's moving quickly. We don't need a large drain field. And then over on the right-hand side, if we look down the right-hand side, we see increasing silt. So from the top to the bottom, we get increasing silt. And in the bottom right-hand corner, that's where we have our silts. These are text group 3. These are kind of intermediate. They don't drain as readily as the sand, but they drain slightly better than the clay. And because of that, we can design kind of intermediate sized drain fields on them. If you have a texture group 3 and 4, so that's saying that if you have a clay soil or a silty soil, then these are the ones that require a reserve. And this can be a 50% reserve, and in some instances, 100 or 200% reserves. Um, this chart here kind of gives an idea of how we define the rate that water moves through the soil. So the red ones are coming from over here. So the sand and loamy sand, we've got 0 to 16 minutes per inch. So that means it'll take between 0 and 16 minutes for an inch of soil to move through. And then as we kind of move through the chart, we see it increasing. The texture group 3, 46 to 90. And then as we get to the texture group 4, these clays, 91 to 120. So the clays, water isn't moving through very readily at all. And in some instances, soils won't percolate soil as fast as 120 inches. And then we have to get an engineered system for those ones. This kind of comes into play, and we can kind of look at an example of kind of how this might influence the size of a drain field. So if we imagine that we have a soil with a 15 minutes per inch percolation rate. So this is a sandy soil. We see that an area required, that's square foot per bedroom, is 198. So we need 198 square foot of soil per bedroom in order to percolate this wastewater in a soil that's got 15 minutes per inch. If we move up to here and go with a soil that's got 105 minutes per inch, so this is a texture group 4, moves much slower, we need 1,038 square foot per bedroom. So we can see it's increased quite dramatically. And for a 3-bedroom house, the 15 minutes per inch requires 594 square foot total, and we do not require a reserve. However, with this 105 minutes per inch, this text group 4 soil, we need 3,114 square feet in order to get rid of the wastewater coming from this 3-bedroom house. And we also require a 50% reserve area. So we get a total of 4,500 square foot. And you can see how dramatic it can be between the texture groups. And this kind of, it can be quite confusing to people because sometimes people will have very large drain fields and their neighbor just down the road will have quite a small drain field. And this kind of speaks to the how different soils can be and how rapidly they can change over a relatively short space of area. Um, so we also look at setback distances, and these two charts are setback distances. These both come from the Virginia regulations. Don't get too bogged down by them. Don't try and look through them all. They're just here to show what we have to avoid when drain fields are going in. So 4.1 and 4.2, this is from septic tanks and this is from the drain field. There's a few more regulations with the drain field than the septic tank, but essentially the very, very similar numbers for both of them. And so we can see that we need to be 5 foot away from the property lines, 10 foot away from a building foundation. If we've got a basement, we need to be 20 foot away. From drinking water wells, it's got to be 50 feet. That's an important one. Shellfish waters, 70 feet. Drainage ditches, they have regulations there. Over here, we've got a few more things included, and we also have vertical separations as well as horizontal separations. But you get the idea that we have specific things on the site that we're looking for to make sure that we've got enough distance from them to be safe. And this kind of comes into play when we're thinking about designing a house. And so imagine that you have just bought this lot of land here, encircled by these yellow lines, and you decide that you're going to build a house up at the front, and it looks out on a beautiful site. Maybe there's a river or something, and there's kind of geese flying by, and it's an amazing view. And so this is where you want to build your house. And so you call up the OSE, and they come out and they kind of start wandering around the lot, and they start umming and ahhing. And they firstly see this pond over here, and they're like, oh, well, we need to stay 50 foot from that pond, so we can't be over here. And then they see the neighbor's well, and they're like, oh, well, we can't be next to this well, so we got to this area of the lot isn't usable. And then in the trees, there's a little creek, got to stay away from that creek, so they move away from there. And then they start looking at the soil and the rest of the lot, and it turns out it's poor soil, and so they stay away from that. And now all of a sudden, the only area that we can actually build a drain field on is the area up at the front where we are hoping to build this kind of house that looks out on the spectacular view. And what happens then? The house has to be shifted to the back of the lot, and you don't get your spectacular view because the drain field is so important when designing houses. So, next, let's look at why septic systems fail and potential water quality issues. So what happens when septic system drain fields fail? Usually, it means that something has made it into the soil and it's started to clog that soil up. So water is no longer moving freely through the soil, it's being held up. And when it starts to get held up, it starts backing up towards the tank, and we start getting big problems, or backing up towards the surface. And suddenly we get wastewater at the surface and potential problems that way. And we also, another problem that you may see is a disruption of septic tank microbes. So we have that population of anaerobic microbes in the septic tank. And if we start disrupting them, killing them in some way, then they don't break down the solids. And because of that, those solids make it out into the drain field. And one of the big reasons that we see these problems is that there isn't enough hydraulic retention time in the tank. That's just a fancy way of saying the water's not in there long enough for the solids to settle out. Okay, so we need that time in order for them to break, for the fog to move to the top and the solids to move to the bottom. And this can happen in a number of different ways. In some instances, it can be that there are too many solids in that tank, which means that the actual volume of water is decreased massively, and so we don't get that kind of that separation of the solids dropping down to the bottom and the fog moving to the top. Another problem may be that there is too much water moving into the tank. So maybe there are too many people living in the house to what the septic system's been designed for. Um, Sometimes if we use harsh chemicals, that can kill off bacteria, and then that bacteria doesn't break down the solids. And in some instances, we can just put down too much oils and greases and fine particles, and they can end up moving through and clogging the drain field. So here's our septic tank. And this is kind of at the early stages. It looks really nice. We've got plenty of space for the wastewater to separate, solids to drop to the bottom, the fats to move to the top. But if we allow those fats to build up and we allow those solids to build up, all of a sudden, all we have to allow the wastewater to separate out is this much smaller volume of soil. So less of those solids can actually start settling out. And what happens then is that every time wastewater comes into the tank, it starts to get dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. And then at that point, we start moving this kind of dirty water out into the drain field. That goes into the drain line and starts clogging the soil and stopping water moving through the drain lines, through the soil. How can we tell that a septic system has failed? Kind of one of the big tells is that it smells kind of bad. It's usually kind of a musty odor, as and especially after kind of heavy rainfalls, um, or heavy water use in the house, you might start to see or smell it. Also, soggy soil around drain fields is another sign that you may have septic system failures. If you have incredibly lush, thick vegetation over a drain field, that can be another sign that it's starting to fail, and that's because the vegetation's getting hold of the nutrients from the drain field. So it contains nitrogen and some phosphorus and a few other bits and pieces that vegetation really likes. So it starts pulling that up, and it starts to kind of get very lush and thick. If you get standing water on your drain field, if you have slow draining fixtures, plumbing backups, and or if you happen to have your water tested and it comes back with high coliform bacteria or high nitrate in your waters, then that can be another indicator that there may be a problem with the drain field. And here are some pretty good images of failing drain fields. So in this instance, you can see every single drain line that has been put in place in front of this house, and it's got kind of this more lush soil, grass vegetation sat on top of the drain field, and you can kind of pick out each one of the lines. This image over here on the right, you see the same thing. We're seeing this kind of dark green, lush grass surrounded by slightly paler grass. This just kind of looks ugly, and there's something bad going on there. And this is just an open drain, broken open septic tank, I think that one is. So, how do we maintain septic systems? What are our best ways of doing so? Um, So if septic systems start failing, we can cause odors, backed up pipes, ponding of water, improper treatment of pathogens. That's kind of one of the big problems that we're trying to avoid. We don't want those pathogens, and we especially don't want them up at the surface because that means that they are likely to come in contact with humans or potentially animals that may come in contact with humans. And we also have improper removal of nutrients. If we end up putting, if nitrogen ends up escaping from the septic tanks and makes it to waterways, it can cause problems such as algal blooms and eventually eutrophication problems. And all of these things can cause contamination of drinking and surface waters. So one of the most important things to do is make sure that the septic tank is pumped regularly by a licensed service. In this chart here, um, most pumpers will have a chart similar to this somewhere, and it gives an idea of how often a septic tank needs pumping. So generally, we're seeing 1,000-gallon tanks by and large as a minimum. And so then we can look along here. So if we've got 1,000-gallon tank, 4 people are living in the house, about every 2.5 years, that septic tank needs pumping out again. If we've got a really big tank, like a 2,000-gallon tank, and there's only one person living in the house, it's 25 years before it needs to be pumped. Whereas if we've got a very small tank with a lot of people living in the house, it's kind of every couple of months you need someone coming in. But yeah, usually we've got these 1,000-gallon tanks, and so it's usually recommended between 2 and 3 years to have your septic tank pumped, and people will come and they will check your tank, and a lot of them will have a piece of equipment called a sludge judge or something similar, and that can be used to check the depth of the solids and the fats in the tank as well. And so if it doesn't get pumped, then we end up pushing out poor quality wastewater into our drain field, at which point we end up kind of destroying the drain field. If we destroy the drain field, we've got to find another drain field. And if we imagine that the drain field that's in at the moment is in the best place, it can become very, very difficult to find another place, and you may end up having to get an alternative system, an engineered system, one that uses pumps and other treatments, and you end up using electricity, and life can become much more complicated. So maintaining these septic tanks is really, really important. So if you hire a septic tank pumper, you need to make sure that the service is licensed and has a permit to handle and dispose of material. I work quite closely with some people in the Department of Health, and there are stories of rather unscrupulous septic tank pumpers who may not necessarily have the correct license and who may not necessarily dispose of the waste correctly. So making sure that they are licensed and they have a permit to handle and dispose of it is really important. And you can find them online, slightly dated, but in Telegraph directories, and the local health department will have a list that they can share with you of various pumpers. Usually they'll kind of as part of the service, they will look at the liquid level, make sure if the liquid level's high, it may mean that there are problems with the water moving out into the drain field. If the liquid level is low, it may mean that there's a crack somewhere in the septic tank and the water's leaking out somewhere. So they'll check on that. They can look for damage to the T's in the septic tank. They can look at the baffle walls and make sure that the separating walls are kind of in a good place. They will usually pump the tank completely and check for any signs of leakage. There is kind of there's a theory out there where people say that you pump back a little bit of liquid from your septic tank back in once everything's been pumped out, and you use that kind of as a starter, and it sits there and it contains bacteria. And so when the wastewater first starts moving in again, it's got bacteria to start working on it and breaking it down. It There's no real reason for that. There's bacteria coming out of the wastewater that gets put into the tank anyway. So it's just one of those things I don't think is a big problem if they do that, but it's not necessary. So other things that we can do to prevent problems with septic systems need to make sure need to reduce household water use as much as possible. Um, so if you have a toilet that runs continuously or a faucet that runs or drips continuously, it's amazing how much water is actually being released into the septic tank from those. So that continuous running is always adding a small amount of water, and it can be gallons over the course of a day, and tens of gallons, hundreds of gallons over the course of longer periods. So it's by adding that extra water, we lose out on that retention time, and we don't get as much settling. Um, can also use water use reducing technology, and a lot of times this is kind of built into many things that people are buying nowadays. So we don't actually have to search out a lot of times these water saving technology. So low flow toilets, water saving shower heads, water saving faucets, and energy and water efficient washing machines. A lot of things are kind of becoming slightly more efficient. But if you look kind of over here, we've got kind of examples of um, kind of old systems. So an old toilet used to use 6 gallons, and now we've got these kind of low flow toilets that's 1.5 to 3 gallons. So it's a lot less water being used. Um, uh, let's see, teeth brushing. If you leave the faucet running toothbrushing, you can end up pouring 2 gallons of water down your tank. If you just use it to rinse your toothbrush, you can use a lot less water. There are a lot of kind of ways that we can get around using too much water. We need to be careful what goes down the drain. So over on the right, these are my happy bacteria, and they are happy because they are living happily in a septic tank and they've got plenty of organic matter to eat and they are living their best lives. Um, if we start damaging these bacteria, then we stop breaking down the the solids as readily, and that's when we start to see some problems as well. So we need to avoid putting certain harsh chemicals down. You'd be surprised, but people will pour kind of paint thinner. People will pour paint. Um, Antibacterial cleaners are kind of not great because they are bacteria, or there are bacteria that are helpful, and so, but antibacterial cleaners and bleach, we just need to kind of make sure that they're being spread out. So if you use bleach in your washing, don't use bleach to kind of spread it out. So you're using bleach one day and then kind of maybe giving it 3 or 4 days before bleach is used again. Just kind of be sensible in the use of that. Make sure you avoid using any chemical that could potentially that can potentially contaminate groundwater and waterways after the septic system. We need to be careful what goes down the drain. Um, People will flush diapers, which clearly don't break down quickly, and they are going to fill that septic tank incredibly quickly and not break down. There'll be lots of solids, lot less retention time. Feminine hygiene products, flushable wipes is a big one. A lot of times they will say flushable, but then it doesn't say that they actually break down. It just flushable just means that they can flush. And there's a lot of things that I can flush down a toilet that don't break down. Flushable wipes are one of them. Um, so any plastic products that just behaves as a solid and doesn't break down in a septic tank, any kind of excess paper, want to avoid excess kitchen waste. So if you're using a lot of grease, it can be stored in some kind of container and then disposed of by landfill. Garbage disposal units should be used very sparingly or really not at all with a septic system because you are adding a lot of extra carbon and extra solids for the bacteria to break down rather than just the solids from that we want them to break down. And yeah, if you are like me and you enjoy watching people kind of pump out septic systems, there's a whole genre of it on Instagram, and you can watch people pump out septic systems and break down all kinds of solids. Quite a lot of them will use one of these quite cool machines that they stir it all up with and then pump it back out again. Yeah, I recommend it. It can occupy you for hours. So yeah, be careful what goes down the goes down the drain, down the into the septic tank. Need to protect the drain field, so need to avoid putting heavy things on the drain field. We don't want to crush that drain field. We don't want to impact the soil on top. We don't want to cause compaction. Compaction makes it difficult for oxygen to move out, and in order for water to move down, we need oxygen moving out as well. So we need to avoid doing that. You can also directly damage components of your septic system. In this instance, on this image, I think this truck has driven into a distribution box and just kind of dropped in there and crushed it. So kind of avoiding these things is kind of very useful. Be careful what gets planted around a drain field. As I mentioned earlier on, wastewater contains a lot of nutrients that plants really like. So nitrogen, some phosphorus, and it's a source of water as well. So if plants get kind of an inkling that there is nutrients and water to be got at, they will start moving, their roots will start moving straight towards it. And kind of you can imagine the bigger the plant with the woodier the roots, the more problem is. So trees, especially hydrophilic trees like willow, that's particularly, it really, really likes getting water. Trees like that can be very problematic to septic systems, and they will get into every component. They will make it into the septic tank. They will make it into the distribution box. They will get into all the pipes. They can make it into the drain field, into the drain lines. So, like in this instance here, you can see this pipe is just crammed full of these tree roots. And I'm sure that all the plants are just having the best time of it because they've got a huge source of water and nutrients, and they are just growing super happily. So the best thing to plant over a drain field is grasses. Grasses do a really good job. They don't have particularly deep roots, and their roots aren't woody. They are quite soft roots. So it's much more difficult for them to break into components of a septic tank. So you're a lot safer with grasses. You do occasionally get questions about planting a garden of a drain field. And I don't think I would do it, but there aren't any regulations against it, which is quite interesting. I suppose the idea is that any of the waste is moving down through the soil profile, so you shouldn't really be getting anything moving up towards any vegetables that are being grown there. But I don't think I'd take that risk, especially if it fails, then they are directly taking up kind of all that stuff. Use of additives is another question that comes up quite a lot, and you've probably all seen these additives being advertised, and kind of the big one is like Ridex. So Ridex down in the bottom right hand side here, and they come up with all kinds of claims. So they increase microbial activity, they reduce solids, they unclog drains, they reduce odors, they feed the microbes. They come up with all of these kind of these ways of selling these products. But in all honesty, there's no real sense in them. There's not really any advantage to any of them. And so when you actually use these, what you're actually mostly doing is putting some kind of bacteria into the tank. It's another source of bacteria. But we know that our septic tank is full of bacteria anyway. It's full of these beneficial bacteria that are breaking down the solids. And so when you start adding this new bacteria, you're actually creating another source for the bacteria to be eating. So now there's more solids in the tank, and there may not be the right bacteria. And so it ends up not being great. It may not be super harmful, but it's not beneficial. And it's generally just kind of small quantities, so it's not a huge amount of stuff being put in there, so it's not going to do much. In some instances, some of the products contain enzymes, and these enzymes can break down the scum layer. And this isn't good either, because if we start breaking down those fats can move out of the outlet and start heading into the drain field. And you can imagine a layer of fat on top of the soil is not going to is not going to help water move down through the soil at all. Um, so the microbes in our tank, they don't need anything else. They have plenty of stuff in there for them to eat. So yeah, no real sense in using the additives. So let's take a moment to just go through some of the alternative septic systems that we have. Um, Not really necessarily an alternative septic system, but in general, the standard drain field is gravel with a perforated pipe in it. But there is an alternative to that, which are these chambers, and these are plastic chambers. And the chambers are open voids. And so they get put into the ground and backfilled with soil. And yeah, the create a void. In Virginia, we actually get a slight reduction. So we get a 25 reduction on drain field size when using chambers, which makes them quite popular to use. Another good advantage of the chambers is just like we're talking about moving concrete tanks versus plastic tanks. You'd imagine moving large quantities of gravel for a drain field versus some of these plastic chambers is, it's a much easier to move these. You can throw these in the back of a truck and you can have an entire drain field's worth easily transportable. Um, Sand mound systems, these are, you often hear them called Wisconsin mound, and they essentially build up a mound of sand on top of the soil, and then they will use a pump to move wastewater through that sand, then through the soil. So you're adding this extra layer of material to both filter and treat the wastewater before it reaches the soil, which then treats it more before it reaches the groundwater. Um, this is it's called the Wisconsin Mound because it was kind of designed in Wisconsin and is particularly popular over there. Obviously, it's going to be more expensive because you need a pump and you need a pump tank, and it's a more complicated design. So here we've got kind of an example of one going in, so you can see the mound of sand being built up and kind of the gravel and the low pressure pipes being installed. And it's going to get covered over with grass and it'll be just kind of sat there like a mound. It looks a little bit peculiar, but it's a good system. I was talking to one of my friends over at VDH, and they were saying that they once went to a lot, and they went to it had a sand mound, and there were kids doing kind of dirt biking over the top of the sand mound, which is not going to be good for it. So just being aware of what it is and kind of not allowing things like that to happen is important. It is more expensive than conventional systems, and it does have an annual operating cost. Drip systems, these are quite popular um, because you can put them in shallow. And so where we don't have deep soils or good deep soils, a lot of these drip systems go in. And these are pressure pipe, so just kind of these runs of pressure pipe running over the soil. And the idea is that water gets pumped into them and the effluent slowly drips out of these pipes and moves through the soil gradually. And the idea is you are spreading it out across a large area. So here's a drip system up at the top with these purple lines. This one below it is a low pressure distribution system. It runs along similar lines, but rather than being under high pressure like a drip system, it's low pressure and it gets fired out kind of every once in a while. They'll be timed, these systems, so they'll be timed for when it actually kicks out the wastewater. Um, to be designed like this, it's going to cost more money and it requires more maintenance and it's got electricity, so it also increases the operating costs. Anaerobic treatment unit, ATUs. These are, um, remember a long time ago when I discussed how we need 18 inches, but in some instances we can go at 12 inches because we've treated the water to a greater extent. These type of alternative systems treat the water to a greater extent, which allows us to get slightly closer to the groundwater table. And what these do is they add oxygen to the septic tank. And by adding oxygen to the septic tank, we have anaerobic bacteria breaking down some of the solids, and now we have aerobic bacteria breaking down some of the solids. So we get a lot more breakdown of the material that's in the septic tank, which means that by the time it heads out to the drain field, it is cleaner, which means we don't need as much soil in order for it to be fully treated. And so in this instance, it have got a few kind of examples. There's lots of different designs, but most of them will use some kind of air pump to push bubbles into the septic tank, almost like a fish tank where you have kind of the little bubble makers that add oxygen to the soil. Um, there's another example of one here with various different bits and pieces on. They can be incredibly complicated and they do require a lot more maintenance. And there is usually some kind of maintenance contract, and there will be someone coming out every 6 months to check the system, make sure it's running correctly. And the people who do it need to be skilled professionals, and so they will be checking all kinds of things like air filters, seals, oil levels, if there's oil in it, the electrical box, the controls and the alarms. If you use quite a lot of grease in your household, then these systems can get clogged up very rapidly with grease. These can be a lot more expensive than conventional systems, and the operating costs can be much more expensive because you have to pay for people coming out to check on it. You have to pay for various upgrades or kind of replacements that need to happen. Sand filters. Sand filters are a little bit like the sand mound that we talked about, but they're almost like almost modular pieces. So it's a kind of a an enclosed sand it's an enclosed sand mound in many ways that wastewater gets pumped to the surface of, and it moves through, and then it gets collected, and then it gets moved out to the drain field. So they're usually watertight, and they can recirculate the wastewater as well. Can kind of get double treatment. It depends on the design of them, various different ones. So here we have kind of a sand treatment. You can see it's in some kind of watertight container. But we also have something that's very similar to sand treatment, and that's peat filtration. And it's kind of designed in the same way. The wastewater gets trickled over the top of the peat, and peat's very good at kind of grabbing hold of various pollutants. Um, Both of them, well, the peat especially, it does need replacing and kind of fluffing up every once in a while. And a lot of these peat systems have kind of moved away from the peat, and a lot of them are kind of moving towards coconut husks, which are they're a little bit longer lasting. The peat breaks down. It broke down much more quickly than expected, and so needs replacing a little bit more often. And then we have constricted wetlands. These are quite cool systems. They're essentially a wetland, and the water comes from the septic tank, moves into the wetland, and inside the wetland, we've got plants such as rushes and reeds, and they start using any of the solids or any of the components that they find useful. And so they kind of it's an additional treatment. And so once the wastewater has been treated by that, it can move out to the drain field beyond it. These kind of like the sand systems, they are waterproofed, so water's not just moving everywhere. And the interesting systems, the problem is with them is that there is almost effluence at the bottom of them. So if you can imagine that if there's any animals that can kind of get in and around them, it may be vermin, it may be that you have a dog that particularly likes jumping in ponds. You can this is not a good pond to have dogs jumping around in. So they do need kind of blocking off and making sure that they are secure. And that I actually have a second quick presentation, if you don't mind. I'm going to pull that one up because something came up recently. And let me see. So I work quite closely with Virginia Department of Health, and one of the people with the Virginia Department of Health, Ann Powell, she's one of my friends, and she's been kind of pushing this for a while. So this is promoting tank and well safety. And so I've started incorporating this on the end of some of my talks as well, because I think it's a very important thing to be discussing. Um, so what is the big deal? And these are some instances that Anne has come up with across Virginia. And let's get the laser pointer again. And so this is 5 instances where septic tank safety and well safety has caused problems. Some of them tragic problems. So this is this is Anne's dog, and she was walking it around in some woods, and this is an uncovered abandoned well. And so this is apparently there's a high school not far away from this. You imagine that high school kids were probably hanging around in these woods. There's a potential for someone to fall into one of these and it could end tragically. She saw this and she contacted, I mean, she works with Department of Health, so she could kind of quickly contact people and say, look, there's a great big hole in the ground. And this got covered up relatively quickly because of that. And yeah, nothing bad happened from that one. So this is in Pulaski County, so not too far away from us. And in this instance, they found a missing 5-year-old boy inside a septic tank. He had died. So this is an incredibly tragic story. This is in Hanover County, and 2 boys fell into a well, and they were brothers. Supposedly, the older brother kind of propped himself against the back of the well and used his legs to hold his younger brother up before they could get rescued. So it ended well, but it was just an open well top. So we've got all of these instances where we're seeing open systems and people falling in them. This is Northumberland County. This is another instance where a small child fell into a septic system and died. This was 2024, so very, very recently. Um, and this is when Anne was just going around a brewery over in Charles City County. And, as kind of enthusiastic septic people, we always kind of looking out for where's the septic tank, where's the drain field, what's going on. But she came across the riser from the septic tank. And as you can see, there are no screws in the riser, so she can just pull it up. And this is at a brewery that was very, very popular with families. So a lot of children kind of running around. And you can imagine if a child sees something like this, they're going to jump up and down on it and have kind of adventures. And it could end incredibly badly if that gets tipped over. We don't know what could happen. And it's all for the sake of a few screws. So she went to the owner and told him about it. And he kind of dealt with it instantly. And he dealt with it instantly because the problem was brought to his attention. So, kind of, what are we going to do about it? Well, with well coverings, you need to make sure that the well coverings are on them. And in fact, it is a class 3 misdemeanor, and you can have fines up to $500 if your well doesn't have a well covering. So kind of really important if you see something like this, say something. Just make people aware of what's going on. With septic tanks, we have these things that are now coming out. They've been coming out for a few years, and they're called secondary safety devices. So in my images, I showed you some of the risers. Within those risers, we can put these secondary safety devices, and there's a lot of different designs. But the main goal of the design is to allow the tank pumper to get his pump in there, or to get a sludge judge in there to test whether we've got enough solids and fats. And so each one of these is these open spaces, but they also do not allow anything to fall, or any kind of child or even a pet to fall through them. So you can stand on these rope ones. You can jump up and down on the plastic ones. They're incredibly solid. And so we are currently going through the regulations. They're being revised. So every couple of weeks we meet and sit for 4 hours going through these regulations. But one of the good regulations that we're trying to get in is making sure that we have these secondary safety devices um, on all new septic tanks going in. But with old septic tanks, they may not actually be there. Although you can buy them afterwards, aftermarket ones that should fit all septic tanks. And so this is kind of the regulations that we're hoping to get in there, which would be great. And so we're kind of hopefully kind of by word of mouth and by me telling you, you become aware, and then you can tell other people potentially with septic tanks, just to be aware. Make sure that your lids are properly screwed down. If you can get a secondary safety device, get a secondary safety device in there. And when we think about the cost of them, they're not particularly expensive. So a lid, concrete lid, is going to be 170 for a well, 50 for a septic tank, 64 for a plastic lid. Secondary safety devices, we're looking at about $33. I know with Infiltrator, they design all kinds of secondary safety devices. They're kind of working very hard on this, and just a bag of screws to hold down your septic tank lid. Again, doesn't cost anything, or well, costs very little, $5 for a big bag of screws, and it could mean kind of the safety of small children. So this is just something I wanted to make you aware of, and just urge you to kind of, if you see problems with kind of unscrewed septic tanks, just let people know that this is potentially a problem that could happen.